We're on Kuf Gimel Amid Aleph by the two dots, 7 lines from the bottom. So we said in the Mishnah, again, we were talking in the Mishnah about someone who buys a base core of sada, of offer, of field, and it has these rocks, or it has holes in the ground. So we said if the rocks are more than 10 tfachim high, or the holes are 10 tfachim deep in the ground, then they're not part of the sale. The person's going to have to make it up to the seller's going to have to make it up to the buyer. But if it's less than 10 tfachim, then it's counted along with the rest of the field. It's included in the sale. Amar Rav Yitzchak, Trashim she'amru, these we're really talking about the rocks. We're talking about going up. These rocks that are less than 10 tfachim high, that the purchaser, the buyer, has to accept as part of the base core, is base arba kavan. That's only limited if the square footage that it takes up. In the Mishnah, we talked about the height. Now we're saying it only has to take rocky ground up to 4 kavan. So again, just to give you some idea of the scale, we're talking about arba kavan for a. Well, I guess it's not going to make a difference. But in the case of the Mishnah, we're talking about a base core. A base core is made up of 30 saw, and each saw is 6 kavan. So this is 2/3 of a saw, which 30 of them make up a base core. So what he's saying is, up to 4 kavan, we could tell the purchaser that he has to buy something if it's less than 10 tfachim high. But if it's more than 4 kavan, he's buying a field. He's not trying to buy a beach or a rocky area. So even if it's less than 10 tfachim high, he doesn't want to have such a large amount of rocks in his field. Amar of Ukva Bachama, V'hushim of Loan, B'chamisha Kavan. And he says, that which we say, that he has to accept up to 4 kavan, the purchaser have to sell if he gets 4 kavan. That's only if these kavan are not all in one place. They have to be spread out over 5 kavan. But if it's even if it's 4 kavan spread out in 4.5 kavan of land, that's too much of that's like a big rock in the middle of the purchaser's field, and he doesn't have to accept that. That's Rav Ukva bar Chama's shita. Rav Chia bar Abba Amar Rav Yechanan, V'hushem uvloim beruba shel sad. He says it doesn't have to be that the 4 kav of rocks that are under 10 tvachim are only have to be accepted if it's within 5 kavim. It has to be half of the field. So if you have a field of a base core, half of a base core would be 15 saw. So it has to be distributed within 16 saw. If it's less than, if it's only 14 saw, then the purchaser can object and say, you're selling me a field with a big rocky patch that I'm not going to be able to grow on. Boy, Rav Chia bar Abba. Rav Chia bar Abba asked about this sheet, the last sheet that we said, that the 4 kavim of rocks have to be distributed in roiv of the field in order for the purchaser to accept it. What happens? It is taka within those 16 saw. So it's within the roiv. The 4 kavim are within roiv of the field. What happens if they're concentrated in part of that roiv? So in a roiv, so we said 16 is a roiv of 30. What if then you take the 16 and you divide it into one part that's 9 and the other part that's 7, and you have rubim b'miyuta. So you have 3 of the kavim are in the 7, and 1 kav is in the 9. So rubam b'miuta or miutam berubam mal? Do we say in that case, since the 4 kavim of rocks are not evenly distributed amongst the roiv of the field, but it's more concentrated in the smaller half of that half, or essentially from the quarter. Do we say that case it's not, even according to Rav Rachama, that says it doesn't have to be concentrated within 5, but it could be concentrated in half. But if most of it is concentrated in the smaller part of that half, do we say that the purchaser doesn't have to accept it? Gemara says take. Boy, Rav Yirmi. Rav Yirmi asks the question. So again, we're talking about where we said that a person has to accept 4 kavim in his base core. Now, this is only going in the second shot that it's in half. But so this is really in the whole thing. It's in the entire thing. So really, one might say that this should be only, we're going to have a series of escalating questions. And this is talking about we only have 4 kaf, so it really should be disregarded, and the purchaser should have to accept it. The Gemara asks, boy, Rav Yirmiyah, kishir ma. What if the rocks, these 4 kavma rocks, are put in an annoying way? They're a circle around the whole inside of the field. So where the owner doesn't have any opportunity really to make very long furrows, because he's going to constantly have these rocks getting in his way. So although in the middle of the hole of the circle, he'll be able to make a full row, but on the edges, he's going to have interruptions from these rocks. Maybe that's worse. Then the Gemara asks, what about an even more annoying case for the purchaser? Kishuramau. What if it's like 2 rows next to each other? So it makes it hard, or 1 row. So in that case, every time he goes across, he's going to have to hit this rock, this line of rocks. And also next to the rocks, he's going to be interrupted by them. There's no holes in this row of rocks. And the Gemara asks, it's tadinan mao. What if it's like an itztada is a stadium? Because that's what they would call a bull. Bulls were associated with stadiums. So if it's in the shape of a bull's horns, so it's 2 straight lines that then diverge at the end. So part of the way you have a straight line that you can go straight, but then at the end it curves, and that makes it very hard to do your neat furrows. And finally, derech aklasa mao. What if it's the shape of a W, where it's a crooked line that goes up and down throughout the field? So that's going to stop him from going in any direction from the farmer to having any kind of straight rows. Are any of these or all of these considered to be so difficult for the purchaser that even though it's 4 kavim, which really should be good according to the Mishnah, do we say it makes it too difficult for him to use the field, and therefore he doesn't have to accept? The Mishnah, the Gemara says, take Tana, Imhaya Sel Yechidi. So the Rashbam explains, if you have 1 sela, a rock, afilu kolshu, that is right next to the boundary of the field. So ein nimdad ima, it's not going to be considered part of the field. So it's right next to the field, right outside of the boundary, but right next to it. One might say, okay, he's allowed to have a 4 kav rock, and this is right next to the field. So maybe he's allowed to, that the seller can count that as part of the field. The Gemara says, no, afilu kolshu, even if it's outside the slightest bit, and even if it's less than the amount that would make it separate, it's still going to be counted separately because it's not in the boundaries. The purchaser is not going to have crammed down on him that he has to accept this rock that's outside of that's adjoining the boundary, and that the seller is going to say, oh, if it was a middle, I could disregard it, so therefore I'm just going to include it in the sale. And not only that, if it's within the boundary of the field, but if it's part of the rock, even if it's less than 10 tvachim, so you're allowed to have up to 4 kavim of less than 10 tvachim. But if some of it is on the boundary, then the purchaser can say, that's on the outside. I'm not counting that as part of the field that I'm buying. Ein nimdadima. It's not going to be included. Boy rapapa. Mufsik offer bentayim mao. What happens if this rock is within lavud? We always disregard lavud. It's within a small strip of land is separating this rock that's less than 10 tefachim and 4 kavim wide from the boundary. Do we say we disregard that small strip of land? We treat it as if it was on the boundary. And if it's on the boundary, like we just said, it would be excluded from the sale. What it says, again, that's a question. We're not sure if we look at it that since it's an insignificant amount of land between the rock and the boundary, it's treated as outside, or do we say no, as long as there's any amount of land, it's part of the field, just like if it would be a middle of the field, it would be sold along with the field. This is also. Boy Ravashi. What if you have a rock that's, like we said, not only is it less than 10 tvachim high, it's actually covered with a little bit of dirt. So that means so this rock is sitting on top of our dirt. So you can really take away the rock and you'll have dirt underneath it. Or the other way around. You have actually the rock is covered by a little bit of earth. So you could grow on that land. Now, do you treat that as a rock that's next to the boundary? Or do you say since it's either covered with dirt or there's dirt underneath it, it's even a little better than the kind of rocks that we've been saying that the purchaser has to accept? In this case, even though it's in the part that's near the boundary is a little bit less rocky than what we've been talking about, because there's either earth right underneath it or on top of it. Therefore, the purchaser has to accept it in spite of the fact that it's on the boundary. So if Gemara Teku again, this remains a question. Zot the Mishnah. Beis kur afani meichalach. Let's remind ourselves. At the beginning of the Mishnah, the first Mishnah, we're talking about someone said, I'm selling you a base core of afar, land for cultivation. And then there were some parts that were rocky or there were holes. Now we're talking about where he says, base core afar ani meichalach mida bechevel. And I want it to be measured with the rope. I want the measurements to be exact. And then the seller provided him with land that was not precisely according to the measures that they had said. So we're not talking anymore about whether it's a rocky section or a hole. He just added or detracted from the measurement they had said. They had said a base core, which is I think 7,500 kavim, and instead it was 8,000 kavim, or it was 7,000 kavim. So he said pichas koshu, if it's missing any of the land, he had promised to give him a base core, and it's missing even a small amount, Yanaka, the seller has to decrease the price in proportion to what he gave him, because the purchaser had said specifically, I want to have it measured precisely, and since it didn't add up to what he had promised, he has to reduce the price. Or if he added yachsir, we're going to see in a minute, this is going to mean that the purchaser has to pay extra for that amount, what he got. Amar hein chaser hein yaser, and if he says, instead of like the first case where he said, I want you to measure it with a stick, I want it to be extra precise. If he said the other way around, he went to the other extreme. He said, I want to get hein chaser hein yaser. We had this Gemara a couple of weeks ago. If he says, I want you to sell me a base core, whether it's a little more or less, I want it to be a base core. So he's put in language that made it specifically not exact. Afilu piches roy velisa, even if the amount that's missing equals a quarter of a kav per saw. Now again, there are 30 saw in a base core, and each saw, which is not really relevant for this, and there's 6 kavim in a saw. So a quarter of a kav is 1/24 of a saw. So if he said, I'm not makbid on that it should be exactly the right amount. Afilu, up to that amount, even if the amount of land was up to a quarter of a kav per saw, 1/24 of the amount of land promised, or he added on a quarter of a kav per saw, 1/24. Higia, the purchaser keeps it. Yoisemikan, but if it's more than that, Yasa Cheshbon, then you have to make a Cheshbon, and the Mishnah is going to explain exactly what Cheshbon we mean. That means if it's more than 1/24, even though the buyer said, I don't care, it could be more or less. He means more or less, but it's got to be in the ballpark. More than a 24th is not exactly what they had agreed upon. Mahu machzolai, what does he return to him? What does the purchaser have to give him? He has to give him money. That means if the seller gave him more than a quarter of a kav extra, the purchaser has to pay for that extra land. And it's not at the option of the purchaser. He's going to get crammed down on him that he's going to have to buy this extra land, whether he wants to or not, except for under certain circumstances, which the Gemara will discuss. But if the seller wants, it's really the seller's option. He could say, I added on extra land, and it's more than the amount that could be included, so you have to pay for it. And the Gemara will explain, because a seller, we're talking about where he doesn't have any land on the other side. So if he's just going to be left with this little stub of land, it's not going to be useful. A wheat field, that is, like we said, if we're talking about a base core, so we're talking about 1/24. A base core is 180 kavim, which is, or 30 saw. So you're going to talk about 1/24. It's going to be, I believe, 7.5 kavim. So if it's only that amount, the seller's not going to have anything to do with it. So you could tell the purchaser, you have to pay me for it, and you're going to get it. But if the seller, for some reason, wants to hold on to it, he can, if the seller wants, he can take back the karka. So why do we say that the seller has to pay for the extra land? That's to help out the meicher, the seller. Shimshaya b'sada base tisha kavin, because if he's left in the sada 9 kavin, so that's an amount that that a person is not able to profitably in the case, once it reaches 9 kavim, so at that point it already becomes a field, a chashuv field on its own, and then the purchaser doesn't have the seller can't tell the purchaser, you have to take this extra shtickle, because I don't want to be left with a useless amount. But rather he has to take the tisha kavim and use it. I think this is an absolute amount. That means even if he sold him 2 base core, it would still be 9 kavim is always a useful field. It's not a percentage amount. If it's over 9 kavim, at that point, the seller loses the option to either tell the buyer, you pay for it, or if he decides he wants to keep it. Once it's 9 kavim, he has to keep it, and the purchaser can say, I'm just gonna give you back. I don't want to pay you for it. You keep it. Ubegina, that's true about a field of tvua, that 9 kavim is a chashuv amount. Ubegina base chatzi kav. In a garden or in like a vegetable garden, so that's smaller patches of land, even a chatzi kav is a chashuv amount. So if the seller added on an extra chatzi kav, he can't tell the purchaser that he has to take it. Ukedivrei Rabbi Akiva beis roiva. According to Rabbi Akiva, who's chaylik on the Tanakam, he says even a quarter of a kav is a chashuv, a piece of land to be used as a vegetable garden. Machzaleis karka. In that case, in all these cases, if it's 9 kav or a chatzi kav to the Tanakam, or according to Rabbi Akiva, a quarter of a kav of a vegetable garden, in that case, the purchaser can return the karka. This is what we had all the way back, that whole Gemara, that we say that once it went over the amount that was allowed to be put in as extra, what he said, so he's allowed to do up to a quarter of a kav per saw. But once he went over, then the entire amount is included, that the purchaser has to compensate the seller and take it all back. So Gemara, Ibayalahu. Base korstama mai. What happens? We had the Mishnah given 2 cases. It said base kor afani moichelach mida bechevel, where he said specifically, I want it to be measured precisely. And the next case of the Mishnah was where he said, I pachas a I'm not. He said specifically, I don't care that it should be precise. What happened if he said stam? He just said, I'm buying a base kor. Tashma, Gemara wants to bring a riot. Base kor offer ani moichelach. Our Mishnah said, I'm selling a base kor mafar mida bechevel. And he says, I want it to be measured precisely with the rope. Pichas kol shu yinaka, yasa kol shu yachse. In that case, if he said specifically, I want it to be exact, then if it's any more, any less, or any more than what he had promised, then the buyer doesn't have to take it. He gets compensated for the amount that's missing, and he can return anything that's extra. Hastama kehin chasahin yasadami. The mashmais is only because he said specifically, I want it to be exact. But if it was stam, it would be treated as if he said, I don't care how much it is. But then the Gemara says, Ema seifa, b'mama lehin chasahin yasa, afil pichas raiva l'sa, ahisar l'sa, higil. Hastama kemidas cheveldan. But if he says the mashmais from the second part of the Mishnah is only when he says pichas raiva l'sa, ahisar raiva l'sa, then we say that the purchaser can't back out of it, even if it's up to a raiva asa. But to mashma the stama, he can. It's treated as if he said specifically, I want it to be in mouth. Since the Mishnah has both extreme cases, we don't know what the stam cases is. Talking about Toshma, base kor offer ani moichelach. There's a Bryce that says, if he says base kor offer ani moichelach, I'm selling you a base kor offer, which is stam. Base kor offer ani moichelach. If he said, I'm selling you about a base kor offer. Hein chaser, hein yaser ani moichelach. He said, more or less, I'm selling it to you. Afilu pichas raiva l'sa, ahaiser raiva l'sa higiyah. Since these are all the mashmais of this Bryce is, these are all the shyness that mean that he can do, that the purchaser is giving leeway. So therefore, as long as it's less than a raiva asa, the purchaser has to take it. Almastamanami kain chaser and yasadami. Mashmais is we included as the case. The first one was base koraf ani ma'chalach, which is stama. It's mashma. It's the same as the other 2 examples of kibase or ya pachas or yaisa. So no, maybe not. Hasan perusha kama farish. Maybe it's coming to explain ezu base korshu. The first thing is not example. First, it's saying ezu base korshu base kor. What is considered to be that it's only that the purchaser is saying, I want about a base core. It's what he says to him, but if he did stam, it would not be treated as yes. Maskul Ravashi asks on this pshat. The language of the Bryce is not much like that. If it wanted to say what is the case of base core offer that's treated as if he's adding language that says he's not makbid, it wouldn't say base core offer ani moichalach ke base core. He should say base core offer lach base core offer ke base core offer ani moichalach. The fact that we added an extra time and said moichalach ani moichalach in each one, it sounds like the Bryce is giving three discrete examples. It's not that the second two are explaining the general din. You see from here that stam is treated as if it said a little bit more or a little bit less. Shmaminu. We can see that. Okay, I think we'll stop over here because I'm pretty much done. Hopefully tomorrow. I think I'm getting to that part of the code